So we're going to start off with Module 3 right away with just a list of the principles of design. So in the introduction, we came up with a definition of composition as being the way the artist organizes using these principles of design. And so here we see the list. You don't need to copy them all down. We're going to go through them together one at a time through the course of the first part of this module as we cover Chapter 4 and Chapter 5 together. So the principles briefly are unity and variety, balance, emphasis and subordination, directional forces, repetition and rhythm, scale and proportion. So notice how a lot of the terms in this list sort of happen in pairs. What we're going to find is that there's an interrelationship between two seemingly opposite terms. Very interesting. One last thing before we start looking at some imagery together. Design as a word can be used as a verb and as a noun. So we can say that the artist is a designer, that the resulting image is a design, or the act of making the thing is designing process. Okay. So the principles of design, these terms are all natural parts of our perception and they apply to all forms of art. The book talks about this painting by Charles Demuth, I Saw the Figure 5 in gold, as a concept that arose out of the artist's intention to make a portrait of his friend, the poet William Carlos Williams. Demuth thought of a poem that Williams had written after seeing a fire engine with its sirens blaring as it raced through the city on a rainy night. Fire engine number 5 stands in for a portrait of the poet. So knowing that his friend is a poet, knowing that poetry is also about observation in some ways, in similar ways that painting can be, Demuth chose to make an image that reflected those aspects of the poem as a reflection of the poet. And so I just want to read the poem very briefly. It's called The Great Figure by William Carlos Williams. Among the rain and lights, I saw the figure 5 in gold on a red fire truck, moving, tense, unheeded to gong clangs, siren howls, and wheels rumbling through the dark city. So it's a very sensory description. It's almost like you could be there, seeing those things, picturing them in your mind as the poem sort of puts those out for us. I think we do not necessarily need to know the backstory of the work to appreciate a similar visual kind of dynamism in the elements chosen by Demuth and in how he organized them. I think there's a poetry to that. There's a poetry in the selection that echoes the sound and the emotion and the expression of the language in the poetry. In selecting composition, Demuth used several important principles of design. Unity is certainly one of them. And so in this painting, the large numeral 5, the fact that it takes up so much of a portion of the design and that it brings through together a variety of colors makes it a very unifying element. Okay. It overlaps all the colors. We can see in the slightly changing values of the number 5, the way it relates to changes in the colors behind it as well. So they're linked together visually, and that link, that scale of the numeral makes it a very strong unifying element. Okay. Balance as well, although the number 5 is centrally located, which could be a potentially problematic thing. If something is in the center, then we need a reason to continue to move around the design. So although it is certainly located in the center, it is not a symmetrical composition. In other words, if you divide it in half, it's not a mirror image, right? And yet it still feels balanced. Scale and proportion is a part of that balance. So there are larger and smaller versions of the number 5, and the largest is emphasized, whereas the smaller ones play a subordinate role in design. So emphasis and subordination is happening here. Variety as well. We see variety in terms of the repetition of the numbers, and as well as a variety in the repetition of those limited colors of red and gold and gray. So very small number of colors at work in the painting, but a fairly wide variety or range of variations of those colors. So that's part of its dynamic as well. I think the way that the dots are placed around the composition starts to feel almost like headlights passing us. There's very much of a sound, a kind of a sequential movement that happens here that makes it feel both like the diagonals that we see are rain kind of slanting in the wind perhaps, but also moving through the streaks of rain as well. Very, very interesting. Artists do not always use all the design principles in every work of art. We'll explore each one in more detail as we move through the chapter together. And as we can see from this example, that they not only help us understand how artists work, but they also have an effect on how we view the work. Right? These are visual choices that start to feel like they have some of the sensory quality of the experience that Demuth identified in the poem by William Carlos Williams. And really the only thing here that might indicate a literal nod or a literal sense of portraiture to this painting is the word bill in the upper left-hand corner, right? So unity then, to define, is a sense of oneness. It's a sense of things belonging together to make up a complete whole. And as we talked about in the previous image, unity and variety work together. The two things coexist in a work of design. It's almost like if we see too much unity, then things can look a little bit too stable, too boring, too uninteresting. And just the way that variety can create just enough of something different that we start to make comparisons within the work of art. So the appearance or condition of where there are things that appear to belong together, that when taken together, they make up a complete whole. So this artwork by John McCracken, Untitled, from 1970, is so unified. Very few works are as unified as this one. So again, I like to think of this sliding scale in terms of unity and variety. Where is that slider from one end of the spectrum to the other? And this one's almost all the way towards unity. McCracken was an artist who was involved in the minimalist art movement of the 1960s and 70s. Minimalist art is, at the most basic level, art that is interested in stripping things down to the most barest possible essentials and still have an artwork, right? So minimal, least and most bare possible essentials. McCracken also went to school in California. He lived and he worked in Los Angeles, and the materials that he used for this piece and what would become ultimately multiple pieces and a signature body of work known as plank pieces. It's the same materials that are used in the California car culture and surf culture as well. So this resin, fiberglass, and wood show up in the local culture of the time in the area where he lived. The yellow is the same color throughout the entire piece. It's really only the play of light that makes this seem like there's any variation at all, right? There is a variation in height and width, but overall, there's so little variety that this is really a great example of extreme unity. It's a natural human impulse to look for difference. So when I look at this piece, I also start to notice the fact that it's leaning at different distances from the wall. That becomes something I feel like I should make some meaning out of when I look at the work. I also look at the shadow as being related to the play of light against the piece. Unity and variety, working hand in hand. So a work of art might be very unified, but also boring. Variety is what provides diversity in a work of art. It's what can pique our interest and make us want to keep looking and spend time with the work. So we're kind of looking at a couple of extremes in order to really understand what these terms mean. So variety basically is difference. So if it's not a sense of oneness, it's variety, and variety is difference. And the idea is that difference adds interest. It's almost like entering into the work and getting our curiosity piqued. What does that mean? What's that mean? What's that mean, right? So it provides diversity. So the composition is interesting to look at. And that is actually a counterpoint to unity. I think that's a good way to think about it. This is an outdoor installation by the artist Sarah Z. It's called Triple Point, and it is an example of extreme variety. She uses all sorts of materials. There's stones, aluminum tubing, rectangular panels across the facade of the building, as well as on the ground before it and in the air above it. So at first it looks like there's so much variety that it's completely chaotic. But she did introduce some orderly elements. And the longer we spend time looking at this image, the more we start to see that circle of fragments in the foreground. The aluminum tubes form diagonals, right? Think about movement, form diagonals that lead the eye towards the top of the building. Oval rocks and rectangles also punctuate the design, so there's a little bit of emphasis that's happening there, right? The work seems to have been created by improvisation. And if we know a little bit about Sarah Z's work, improvisation is something that's very important to her. So for more of her work, and also to hear her talk a little bit about her interest in why she makes what she makes, I've included a link to a TED Talk, an artist talk. It's about 15 minutes long, and you'll find that link on the Canvas additional resources for Module 3. Okay, unity and variety working together. So we've already seen that too much unity has one certain visual quality to it, and a whole lot of variety has another visual quality to it. So let's look at this example by Joseph Lawrence for understanding how they may work together in a way that helps us to kind of really get that concept, that sort of comparative relationship. Lawrence was an American painter known for his portrayal of African American historical subjects and contemporary life. For his compositions, he found inspiration in everyday life in Harlem. So the hard, the bright, and the brittle aspects of Harlem during the Great Depression inspired him as much as the colors and the shapes and the patterns inside the homes of the people that lived in his neighborhood. Even in the home where he grew up, Lawrence talks about how colorful and full of pattern that was. In his painting, Going Home, that we're looking at here from 1946, there's a beautiful balance between unity and variety. He established what we might call visual themes, with the lines and the shapes and the colors of the train seats, as well as the figures and the luggage. And then he repeated and varied those themes. So notice the various repetitions of the green seats and the window shades, right? See how we see that color kind of moving through the design, but the shapes of them will change slightly. So there's repetition and variety even within one form, like those green window shades and green chair seats. As a unifying element, red is used in a variety of shapes. So the same red occurring in multiple locations throughout the composition and identifying different elements, right? The many figures and objects in this really complex composition form a unified design through the artist's skillful use of abstraction, theme, and variation. The diagram of the work shows some of the ways that abstraction can be seen within the elements that he's actually depicting or describing. These are structural elements, particularly if you start to look at the repetition of the shapes of triangles and the strong diagonals that almost always intersect with horizontals. That is a very structural element within this composition that helps those diagonals find some stability within the design. So movement and dynamic together with stability. Again, we have this co-relationship, this co-participation between these qualities that make the composition both dynamic and unified. Lawrence was really known for this lively sense of harmony and very distinctive compositions. He referred to his style as a dynamic cubism. We're going to look at cubism a little bit later on down in our time together, but it was a movement that was popular in Europe, and it drew great inspiration from West African and Mesoamerican art. So that's important. That dynamic cubism, a term that Lawrence gave his own artwork, would relate to a Western tradition of art making that has roots in African art and in Mesoamerican art. Lawrence was a student of art. He studied other artists' work, and he was influenced by painters who were design problem solvers, very much an artist interested in the act of designing these abstract shapes for the sake of designing. Pieter de Hooch's interior of a Dutch house balances unity and variety in different ways. So when we look at this painting, it has a fundamentally different quality to it. The energy is much quieter. The light is much softer. The color more muted, for example. So there's a conversation happening in this painting between two seated women and a standing woman around a table inside a room with a checkered floor. They're in front of a window on the left side of the canvas. Another woman is standing on the right near the fireplace. It's not overly crowded, and the interactions between the people are relatively easy to understand through the way they look at each other and the way they gesture to each other. Also, the artist made a really liberal use of these squares and rectangles on the floor, and as well as in the decorations on the rear wall. And then also look at the ceiling. We see them repeated there as well. The diagram shows some more of these kinds of interconnections between the formal choices. So what we really see in this painting are variations of rectangles within rectangles within rectangles within squares, whether they are literally built into the design of the interior of the room, as in the floor and the ceiling, or whether they are elements, visual elements that decorate the interior of the room, as the map on the wall or the painting above the mantelpiece. But then look at the mantelpiece itself. Notice the way the fireplace frames that one independent figure sort of away from the group. And then the entire room really frames the ones who are seemingly much more in conversation together. So again, we have this repeated visual theme of rectangles and squares that function as organizing elements in this design, things that can interconnect the individual parts of the figures themselves and their activity to the room, right? Unity and variety in beautiful harmony here. So balance. Balance is really about visual equilibrium. There are two kinds of balance that we're going to talk about. Symmetrical balance, which is the form of a design will mirror, the forms will mirror each other if you divide it in half, either vertically or horizontally. So it's about equilibrium, but not about absolute stillness. And that's the challenge of it, right? So it's relatively simple, easy to see when something is symmetrical, that the two halves of one thing are held in check by mirroring each other, right? So in terms of, we think in terms of a scale, you know, the old time scale with chains and two plates, right, to measure weights. So if we put equal amount of weight on either end of the scale, and this is what we're looking at when we have visual equilibrium in a sense of symmetry, the way these two images are working. So it's a basic instinct to seek balance in art, and our instinct to be balanced as human beings is a part of that. It's related to that, I think. It's a parallel kind of desire. I like to tell my students when thinking about balance to just check in with how your body feels. So if right now I'm standing as I talk with my weight evenly distributed between my feet, so there's no shift one direction or another, right? So I am in a state of standing equilibrium here. And so that has a feeling to it. And when I look at works that are balanced in this way, there's a similar, yes, sort of shared relationship between the two parts of the whole, right? The two halves of the whole. I'm still continually considering how my vision roams between the two, but they're very balanced in terms of their visual weight. And so this kind of symmetry is often used in architecture, as in the example that we're seeing here, James Hoban's design for the President's House in 1792. It's a case where nearly or exactly matching halves of the left and right side of either a three-dimensional form or a two-dimensional composition are at play. So in this case, as in the actual construction of the White House itself, we're looking at a symmetry that has a vertical balance, right? But symmetry can also be balanced along a horizontal axis as well. So this is a beautiful work by Haruka Kojin called Reflect 2. It is a sculptural installation. This is based on an experience that the artist had. She saw a reflection of a tree in the water when she was on a walk that joined so perfectly with the appearance of the tree itself that she said it seemed as though there was a giant tower floating in the air before her, perfect and eternal. So as I say that and I look at the work in the image, I can start to see that center line almost has a quality of movement to it, that central axis that runs horizontally through the sculpture, and then comparing above and below, above and below. And there are places where the two halves seem to be more merged, and there are places where there's more air between the forms, and I think if I start talking about the work in those terms, I can start to make a connection to the experience of walking in nature and looking out at a body of water and seeing the tree, and then seeing the tree merge with the reflection of the tree in the water, and how that might be an inspiration for this piece. She said that she felt disoriented and lost in space. And think about it, you don't quite know where you stand. It's almost like being in a dream. She gave form, Kojin gave form to her vision by using fabric petals from artificial flowers. They were flattened and grouped and then suspended by threads from the ceiling. So the sculpture itself seems to float before us. The little detail, I hope, on the bottom right of your screen will help you to see that quality just a little bit more. The petal groupings are hung in different places in depth. So some of them are closer to us and some of them are farther back. That means that their relationships will shift slightly as the viewers move around them. So the perfect symmetry of the whole is really only visible for a moment, and then it vanishes, much like the artist's own vision. Okay, so I think we'll take a little tiny break at this point before we come back for episode 2. Just for a brief reflection. If you on this break, I'd like you to just consider the question of how do you create order in your life? We're trying to find a parallel between order and the artist's desire to give order to an idea. So how do you create order in your life? What kind of order do you crave, right? Balance, perhaps, right? In what ways do the organizing principles of design work similarly to the ways we create order in our lives? I'll leave you with that, and we'll see you shortly for episode 2 of module 3.